Hi, welcome to the third and final event in our series on the future of local news. I'm Kristen Muller. I oversee news programming and podcasting at KPCC and LAist. We at KPCC and LAist are grateful to USC Annenberg for their partnership in these discussions, and also to our past panelists who have spoken so thoughtfully about making our organizations and our journalism more inclusive and equitable. If you've missed these previous talks, we also discussed the importance of a strong local news ecosystem and how newsrooms can collaborate with each other and community members to help build trust and also reach people who have not traditionally been prioritized by for-profit journalism outlets. So the big question underlying all of these discussions has been, how do we pay for it? This question is really urgent and important because we know there's a link between civic engagement and the quality of local news. We also know that legacy local news outlets like newspapers are facing what has been described as an extinction level event. That was all before the pandemic. So today we're going to dive into this problem and we're going to solve it. Just kidding, we're not going to solve it. But we are going to talk to a bunch of people who think deeply about it every single day. I'm going to introduce our moderator, Gabe Kahn. He is a USC journalism professor who runs the Media, Economics, and Entrepreneurship program at USC. He studies the economic models of the news industry and consults with startups and established news companies on their strategy. And in 2018, he launched Crosstown. It's a great website that uses data to elevate local news stories. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Gabe and to the panelists.
Thank you so much, Kristen. So welcome, everyone. This is, as Kristen alluded to, this is a crucial discussion that we're having, which is really how do we create a sustainable model for local journalism to survive. The media landscape has shifted so much in the past few years that organizations that once seemed to have a steady revenue stream are watching that dry up. I think it's also important to note what happens to communities when their source of local news disappears. There are sort of profound changes that can impact communities when a local newspaper or radio station or news outlet ceases to exist. It really makes it difficult for that community to have a conversation with itself. It makes it that much more difficult for local government to be held accountable, but also for a community to really sort of understand what important issues are driving it. And we really are, I think all of us on this webinar today are actively engaged in trying to understand what solutions we can put in place in order to address this situation with the urgency that it requires. So let me now just introduce our three panelists. They are Jennifer Preston, who is the Vice President for News at the Knight Foundation and has for years been involved in some of the most ambitious philanthropic support for journalism at all levels, and is now laser focused on supporting local news in a way that can lead to a more sustainable future. Also with us today is Sewell Chan, whose current title is the editorial page editor of the Los Angeles Times, but he has had many different stops in his career, having worked at both the New York Times overseas in New York and at the Washington Post. And also with us is Megan Garvey, who is the executive editor of KPCC, the largest public radio station in Southern California, and who also formerly worked at the Los Angeles Times and has been in the profession working on local news and new solutions for quite some time. So Jennifer, first let me ask you, when we talk about this issue of the problem of sustainability or the problem that local news organizations are facing, a lot of us might think, well, gosh, the New York Times looks like it's doing just fine. So does the Wall Street Journal. What is the big problem here? The picture is very different at the local level. And I was wondering if you could help us just try to understand how we want to define the problem of financial sustainability for local news.
Sure. So the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, they are all doing great. And that's because they have turned to consumer revenue, reader revenue, and they are able to scale a national and an international audience. And as a former member of the New York Times staff with Sewell, I just couldn't be more pleased at the success that the New York Times is enjoying now, with not only reader revenue, but new products like the cooking app, for example. So the big challenge for local news, however, is scale. It's very, very difficult to scale enough readers, enough revenue. But the big challenge that many legacy news organizations around the country face today is that they are owned by private equity funds and hedge funds. And these funds are not making the investments just required for these news outlets to meet the digital realities of today, to really transition to an audience-focused reader revenue model. So that is one of the major challenges facing legacy news organizations.
And so, Jennifer, just to follow up on that, when we talk about sort of what, so certainly these local outlets cannot benefit from these economies of scale, which means they can't have these conversations with large advertisers or large platforms like Google and Facebook. But what is it that we're lacking, and what is it that we're trying to support here?
So at Knight Foundation today, we were thrilled, for example, to announce Newsmatch 2020. Newsmatch is a matching gifts campaign for not-for-profit news. And it is more than a matching gifts campaign. It is designed to promote giving for journalism, and it's designed to build capability and capacity among these entrepreneurs, among these nonprofit news leaders. There's been a whole field that's been growing in the last 10 years. When we began Newsmatch 4 years ago, and we began with 57 not-for-profit organizations. Today, we announced 267 not-for-profit news organizations will participate in Newsmatch. But here's the problem. We now know that in 2020, there are 1,300 hyper-partisan websites. I'm not going to call them news outlets. Let's call them websites masquerading as ordinary local news outlets across the country. And the New York Times recently reported on this fast-growing network. The reporting is based much in research that was done at Columbia University's Tao Center for Digital Journalism. And it's very, very, very difficult now for us to have informed communities when, in addition to misinformation and disinformation spreading through Facebook groups and on social media platforms, now we have outlets masquerading, disguised as ordinary news outlets, feeding propaganda, not journalism, at the local level. So 267 not-for-profit news organizations committed to quality journalism is great, but we must find a solution that scales, and we are running out of time.
Well, thank you. And I think that it's also important to note that those proliferation of these kind of ghost sites, these hyper-partisan sites, they probably wouldn't be able to have the success that they're having if the local news landscape hadn't been so
correct
that there's just open territory for them to just run in and masquerade as a local news site. So this actually sets up my next question for Sewell. Are we missing something in what the value proposition of local news is? How can we kind of redefine that so that the public is engaged in the conversation where we really understand what we're getting out of this? Because, for example, the way that I interact with the Los Angeles Times as a print subscriber and a digital subscriber is still very transactional. I pay you a subscription fee and the newspaper arrives on my doorstep, and I'm literally sort of paying for the news. But actually what I'm getting out of that is much different. And I wonder if you could kind of expand on how we can understand the value of local news.
First of all, thanks so much, Kristen and Gabe, for hosting me. It's such a pleasure to be here with my friends Jennifer and Megan. And thanks for your question, Gabe. I would say that like many local legacy organizations, we've been part of this shift toward audience. So a lot more emphasis on analytics, but it's not just analytics for the sake of making money. It's analytics about understanding our readers and our consumers' information needs and how we fit into them. So just to give some examples, I currently oversee the opinion section of the LA Times. I've been blown away by how valuable our endorsements are. Before heading up into the selection season, obviously in an unprecedented year in which so many people are voting early, so many people are voting by means that they haven't used before, Dropbox, going to their polling center early, right? We had hundreds of readers asking for us for our editorial recommendations. Make them early this year, LA Times. Don't wait, because the voting is starting early. So we accelerated our whole schedule. As you know, here in California, we've got a lot of ballot propositions, a lot of local races, but we made sure to make all our endorsements by the time the county registrars started mailing out the ballots. That's just one example. Another is during the coronavirus, in addition to covering all the tragedies this year in terms of the public health emergency, the racial reckoning, the economic downturn, and of course the wildfires, we've had so many data and graphic tools to help readers understand how these, almost seemingly cosmic phenomena are affecting their local communities. Type in your zip code, see where the fire damage is. This is playing off a lot of work that Megan Garvey started when she ran digital for the LA Times. So I think there's more an orientation towards service, more of an orientation toward the user's information needs. And then I'd finally add to that, value that only can be arrived at locally. Jennifer, as she said, we both worked in the great institution that is the New York Times. Its rise to national and now even global preeminence is a wonderful thing for journalism. But there's no way that it can make up for the cataclysmic loss of local and state journalism jobs. So for me, at least, I run the opinion side, but I certainly think for the news side, a big part of the solution has to be accountability journalism, investigative journalism, stuff that only can be done at a local level by people paying attention to the power players, understanding how the processes work, the laws, the regulations, understanding the multiplicity of government, particularly a challenge here in Southern California due to the multiplicity of different governing bodies here, and don't get me started on the water districts, and people really digging at the records. And the challenge is there aren't enough people, right? We used to have 100 people in Orange County. By the time the LA Times was restored to local ownership in 2018, that number had gone down to less than a handful. Now, we probably can't afford 200, but surely the number for the LA Times in Orange County needs to be greater than a handful.
So thank you very much. And I think that one important element to keep in mind in this conversation is that journalism is constantly changing and evolving. And what we think of and talk about when we mention these things is not necessarily the news sources that I grew up with, et cetera, but it's a completely different relationship that we have with the news. Megan, at KPCC, KPCC itself as an entity has really kind of been at the forefront of establishing a kind of different rapport with its public. And that public can be people who listen to it over the airwaves, people who listen to it online, follow it on social and so forth. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you kind of see your relationship with your audience, for lack of a better word, and what you've done to cultivate that.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about how we want to do the work with our audience and that we believe that we can do more meaningful journalism if we're listening very closely to what our audience needs and what our audience is interested in. And something that has stuck with me for years now, I mean, when I first got interested in the digital side of journalism, because I came out of the very traditional print background myself, as a writer and a reporter, it was, you could see that the ecosystem was moving there, and you could see that people needed to be leaders in that space. And you could also see that it created potentially like a much closer relationship between you and the people who were reading you or listening to you. Because, you could write a letter to the editor, but it's not quite the same thing as like social media or Facebook comments or even comments on a website. And I think the thing that I heard years ago that has stuck with me is that at the beginning of this digital transformation, that basically, all mainstream newsrooms really failed to be useful. Right? They were going to do the same thing they do in print and online and kind of declare victory. But the whole relationship had changed. So when we talk about engaged journalism at KPCC, I had our reporters a year ago go through a whole process around mission statements where we asked them to really think about the communities they were covering and how they could be both for and about those communities. So this gets at issues of diversity and equity and inclusion and thinking about even what the framing of a story is and where you're coming from, right? So you could write, like Josie Wong covers Asian American communities for us. She writes very much for the Asian American community, but other people read those stories and they're often very, very popular because it's of interest to people beyond that specific community. And then, she's listening to what people are saying because we've created a system that makes it very simple for them. We're a big Harken newsroom, which is one of the tools that allows you to really communicate closely with your audience. And I think, honestly, like all newsrooms, I think some people in our newsroom were kind of allergic to it at the beginning. And I think they felt like, they didn't want to be a ticket taker, like they're going to sit there and, field questions. And I do think there's been an evolution where people are realizing we are finding better stories and we are doing more meaningful reporting. So Carla Javier, who did a really great story early this year, which seems like about 25 years ago right now, I'll be honest with you guys, about the Orange County School of the Arts. And I was just talking to her about it the other day, and she was saying without the engagement part of that, without the outreach that we did ahead of it, she never could have found the characters that made that story so much deeper. Because how do you find people who didn't get into a school? And so I think there's been an evolution in our newsroom where our reporters and our editors are realizing that having that like truer back and forth really makes people feel reflected and heard. And that's really important in a public media newsroom because, of course, we are asking people to, use their hard-earned dollars to support our journalism. So we have to be very persuasive that what we're doing is valuable because they don't have to pay for us, right? They can read us online. They can listen to us. They can never give us a penny. They're not going to hit a paywall. And I think that's a real key in the future of local news is building that value proposition and being really clear about why what you're doing is very valuable to your audience.
And so, Megan, do you think, in continuing with the theme of sustainability, do you think that these new ways of trying to reach out to people in the public for story ideas and that kind of engagement, does that translate into them having a different perception of the value that KPCC provides? Is that something that you guys can, in a way, bank on?
I think so. I mean, you see it reflected when people do give. They say back to us some of the things we're saying to them, which is like we're listening to them, we're reflecting them, we're answering their questions. Also, I happen to live in Long Beach, and the Long Beach Post started up, right? And like they just added an engaged journalism person to their masthead. They did things like they had a whole recreation of Long Beach in Minecraft that they invited people to come along on. So I think people are finding different ways to connect with their audience. They don't need to be as big as the New York Times to create a sustainable and valuable local journalism team.
Well, I think, particularly with public radio, people really do have this kind of emotive connection with the classic radio part of it as well, that, something like the New York Times would never be able to recreate. It does have that intimacy to it.
It is striking, Gabe. When I came to KPCC, it was like the people who love, I think it's because they only hear me when I'm asking for money, but they hear other people's voices all the time and they feel a connection to it. And I do think it is different, that kind of connection. They almost feel like they know you.
Right. Now, we've talked about essentially collecting more revenue from the people who engage with journalism. But Sue, I wanted to ask you, are there other policy proposals out there that we should look to in terms of changing the funding picture? Because there's other market forces at play here. One thing that we didn't mention is that Google and Facebook take, by some estimates, 60, 70, 80% of every dollar spent on digital advertising in the US, and everybody else fights over that remaining portion, including local media. And that's not really a fair fight. Are there aside from antitrust litigation and things like that, are there other policy proposals that we should hear about?
Yeah, so I'm going to restrict this part of my comments just to the legacy news organizations. I think public radio and broadcasting is a separate but related subject, as are the nonprofit newsrooms represented by American Journalism Project, represented by the John Thornton initiatives, and all the exciting stuff that Jennifer is working on. Why do the legacies still matter? I'm asked that a lot. They matter not because we were printed on newsprint or because we were started in the 19th century. That's irrelevant right now. They matter because they still do a large bulk of the original accountability journalism in America. That is why they are important. So there's a few efforts to support them. and we've editorialized in favor of most or all of the below. One is make it easier for papers to convert to nonprofit status, as the Salt Lake Tribune has done in Utah, as the Philadelphia Inquirer did when it was acquired by Jerry Lenfest and then turned over to a nonprofit, Lenfest Institute, as was the case in Tampa Bay Times, used to be St. Petersburg Times, bequested by Nelson Poynter upon his death to a nonprofit journalism entity. So one is make it easier for papers, especially the ones that might be owned by chains or hedge funds, to be brought out from that model, which I personally think has failed completely and failed our democracy, and make them independent, self-sustaining, and philanthropically funded. Another proposal, encourage local news subscriptions by allowing Americans to deduct a local news subscription from their taxes, because frankly, that treats local news more as the utility that it is. Obviously, the not-for-profit radio stations like KPCC that I support, I can already deduct that because they're 501c3s. But what if we could expand that to a broader range of local news organizations? And still another idea, one just recently floated by a scholar named Elizabeth Hansen at Harvard's Shorenstein Center, and also supported by Steve Waldman of Report for America, is like a national fund to cut for local news. That none of us wants kind of government control, right? I think we all know that it would be very, very dangerous to have kind of a state-financed broadcaster. Let's look at the reality right now. In 2020, would we exactly trust anyone in government to kind of back up a kind of BBC-style broadcaster for the US? It's probably unlikely given our nation's political and cultural traditions. But what if we could have impartial, merit-based, nonpartisan sources of funding for local and accountability journalism? And I find that very, very promising as well. There are other proposals that I can mention, but where I want to situate the LA Times is we are part of really a small, but I believe precious group of legacy news organizations that became part of chains and thankfully have been freed from them and are now locally owned once again. That would include the Boston Globe, the Minneapolis Star Tribune, us, and then to some extent, they weren't part of chains, but they're really independent, Seattle Times, Dallas Morning News. These are sadly the exceptions because so many of the newspapers in America have been gobbled up by private equity or hedge funds. Now, finally, the last thing I'll say is, and this is something Steve Waldman looks at, is that there's still at least by some measure, 7,000 small newspapers. A lot of these are weeklies, but they're still family owned, they're still locally owned. They're desperate. They don't have, the CMS infrastructure, the digital infrastructure, the audience engagement infrastructure that Megan or I have some access to, even if not enough. They're really out there on their own. What can be done for them? And Waldman talks about the idea of replanting, talks about the idea of helping them become nonprofit so that they don't get gobbled up by the chains, by the vulture funds.
So, I think that we've got to recognize that there's an analogous situation happening with small business, period, across the country as they struggle to compete with the Amazons and others of the world. And that has an impact on a local property market, just the way the demise of a local news organization has an impact on a community. Jennifer, in your work, you come across a lot of startups and legacy places that are trying new things, different things. Are you seeing anything that is working now that is sort of appropriate for this moment in time that you'd like to tell us about?
Sure. First, I want to applaud the great work that KPCC has been doing during the pandemic, and we were excited to help fund a small part of the application of machine learning to help get those questions answered. And we just could not agree more with Megan about the importance of engaging with community, building that relationship to create that trust. And it's that trust that will generate the revenue. We are seeing lots of great ideas across the country. I'll just mention two. One is City Bureau in Chicago, where they now have a program called the Documenters Program, which we are supporting. And what the Documenters Program does is it engages people in community to go out and cover municipal meetings And these are not trained journalists, but they are trained in how to report and cover a meeting. They are given briefings by the Reporters Committee for Press Freedom on what their legal rights are should they get tossed out of a meeting. And they are making this material. They're making this material. Sorry about that. Making this material public so that journalists who used to cover meetings, Sewell and I used to cover City Hall meetings, can find out what the heck is going on. And one of my favorite examples is a documenter showed up at there was a water district meeting in Chicago, Sewell, and he showed up and no one else from the water district did. So he was able to report that the meeting never happened and no one told anybody about it. So, so another really great new approach, because look, sustainability is key and figuring out how to scale sustainability is key. But what's also really exciting are the collaborative efforts that we've seen in Detroit, that we've seen in Philadelphia, and also in Detroit. Megan had mentioned just the power of answering questions, Outlier Media, which was started by a former public radio reporter from Michigan, Sarah Alvarez. They answer questions from Detroiters. And just as Megan said, they have found that by answering questions, one-on-one questions, and using that data in a way, they're able to identify trends, they're able to find stories, they're able to listen in a way that reporters at the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press are just not able to do. So that listening has produced some extraordinary great reporting about water shutoffs, about lenders leaving balloons on people's doors if they were behind in their car payment or their rent payment, like balloons. So everyone in the neighborhood would know that you were behind. So there is a lot of really great work out there, but we must figure out how to scale solutions. We must increase giving for journalism. We need to create a sector. We need to really learn from the arts, learn from education. We are very excited about the American Journalism Project, which Sewell mentioned, which is a new philanthropic venture capital approach to addressing the sustainability issue in journalism. So in addition to providing funding, they're also helping make sure that the investments that they've made in the first cohort, which was this year, of a dozen news organizations, that they have the financial management review and training that they need, the audience development, the technology, the chief revenue officer. So it's more than providing dollars. It's about providing what's needed to build capability and capacity to get the job done. Because again, I got to tell you, it takes a lot to alarm me, but I am alarmed. 4 years ago, it was national cable television networks and Russian trolls that were spreading misinformation and disinformation and deepening our partisan divide. And when you look at all of the polling, the trust in news media at the national level was very low. But 4 years ago, it was still pretty high for local news and among both Republicans and Democrats. And I'm so worried that this partisan, these hyper-partisan political sites, and it's on both sides of the political aisle, trust me, that is going to make it worse. We're not going to have informed and engaged communities, which is Knight's mission. We are going to have uninformed, engaged communities, and that is not a good thing for America.
So those are excellent points about in terms of kind of understanding the larger landscape that we're dealing with, but also just the types of experimentation that's coming out. I also do want to mention that there's a number of listeners here who have put up some excellent questions that we'll address in a moment. Megan, you work in a nonprofit newsroom, which has done a lot of experimentation in terms of podcasts and was mentioned earlier, this kind of machine learning question and answer approach. Yet at the same time, you guys are always on the air asking for money, trying to drum up enough to keep the thing going. It's very difficult to compete in a world which demands such innovation when you operate off such thin margins. And I'm just kind of curious about how you balance the need to experiment and try new things with the very real and pressing reality of trying to make a budget.
Well, I mean, I think that is a challenge. I do think austerity leads to creativity sometimes. But I think, circling back to some of the stuff that Jennifer and Sewell just said, I think, part of the value we have to bring is in the stories you're not going to hear or the approaches you're not going to see anywhere else. And I think, you used to have a very almost flat media market, right? Like the story of the day would basically be the same across whatever, whether it was commercial, news radio, local television, the LA Times, KPCC. And Sewell's 100% right. I mean, a lot of that accountability journalism stuff would come out of the big legacy print newsrooms. And I think that one of the, I don't even know if it's an innovation, but one of the needs we have to all answer for the future, for local news to have a future, is not just being repetitive and collaborating on stories where it makes sense, not just covering the same thing where you don't offer anything new. I mean, what's the point of that? And then I think also, for public media and for these startups, really having a commitment to stepping in and doing that kind of harder edged accountability journalism, doing more original journalism, and not just mirroring what some other newsroom did, because there aren't enough newsrooms anymore. You can't just copy off of someone else. So I think being more distinctive in what we're trying to do and in not wasting all our time on the same things. There's been some progress on this. For example, my newsroom and Sewell's newsroom is part of this California reporting project, which gets at the police records, right? And so there was no reason for each of these newsrooms across the state of California to do this on their own. They would never get the scale needed. Now we got a little bit, run over by a truck by this summer and spring, but that's a really important subject, having a better understanding across the state of California about police accountability. And that's an example where it's innovative. There's some cost, but you get more out of it by finding a way to be collaborative with the other newsrooms. But I do think when I first started in public media, someone from NPR said to me, "Oh yeah, yesterday's news 2 days from now, right?" And it's we can't do that. That's not adding value. So on the face of it, that's not adding value. And so I think that public radio stations are stepping up, and these local nonprofit newsrooms are stepping up, and they are doing substantive, accountability, enterprise investigations. And that's what holds people accountable. You need that level of reporting to hold people accountable. And it is a skill set. You can't just wake up and, there's a whole process to get to that point, as you know, Gabe, very well.
Absolutely. And I think that this type of collaboration that you're talking about also echoes what Sewell was saying earlier about trying to understand the value proposition of local news, that it is a public resource. When, a lot of us grew up in very competitive journalistic environments, and that was really what drove you, was to beat the competitor to a story. And the public isn't necessarily served by that. And the type of collaboration that's happening now across newsrooms, and even with organizations that aren't in the news business, I think also helps to accentuate the fact that this is a public resource being done for the public, and that the public needs to see the value in that, and that they are there to serve the public. Sewell, I want to ask you, and then Jennifer, one last bit on the revenue side. I think that a lot of organizations have begun to squeeze their audiences pretty good for extra money to compensate for what has been a basic, very steep, sharp decline in advertising revenue. And I don't see that advertising revenue coming back in any meaningful way. Are there other revenue opportunities out there that a local news organization can rely on that doesn't trample on their ethics? Now, the Los Angeles Times has, you sold a show to Netflix. That's one thing, and maybe only newspapers in Hollywood or in Los Angeles are going to be able to pull that off. But are there other opportunities out there to find new revenue streams?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned our podcast, Dirty John, our running project Asian Enough, about the meaning of being Asian American. The one about the Golden State Killer. I think the podcasts are one way. We've been partnering with Spectrum, which provides local news here to cable subscribers in Los Angeles. Done a lot of good work with them. I think that's yielding some revenue. There are, of course, public events, which were seen until COVID as one of the most promising potential sources of revenue. Obviously, that's slowed down in terms of in-person, but we just launched the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books, digital only for the first time. We're seeing how that's working. We recently had, a Q&A. We're doing more behind the scenes stuff about how our journalism works. We recently had a subscriber only event just about Los Angeles Times endorsements. But the truth is, Gabe, that, mostly we are shifting from an advertising-based model to an audience and reader revenue model. And that is a hard and wrenching shift, because as you say, the truth really is that we are doing that while we're trying to extract more and more revenue from an aging but very loyal and dedicated base of print subscribers. But we know that that base isn't going to grow. The base that we do need to grow are the people engaging with us primarily via mobile, primarily via newsletters, primarily via digital and digital subscriptions. I don't want to add to the worries that we've discussed here, but one worry that I have is, how many news subscriptions is someone willing to pay for? I am an outlier. I probably pay for 10 magazines and 15 newspapers. I'm in the business. I love it. I'm a proud member of KPCC, proud member of KQED. And then I read some regional newspapers around the country, plus the national newspapers I used to work for. Okay, great, but that's highly unusual. Now, if you go to Apple News, you get a lot of that aggregated, but that's a danger for us publishers because you're going through someone else's platform. You don't, as the publisher, have control over the data, have control over the insights into what that audience is looking for. So look, I'll be really honest. One of the things that depresses me the most is when I hear that the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times have bigger digital audiences in Southern California than the LA Times does. I respect so much what those institutions do. They're wonderful. If you're a business person, if you're, you want the sense of national politics, you want the foreign coverage, which I used to work in, all that's excellent. But we've got to make the pitch that if you're not subscribing to local news, you're not fully informed, you can't be a parent, a taxpayer, a civically engaged, someone who is in the know civically. And such an amazing part of public broadcasting is that when I'm a KPCC member, I'm showing something not just about what I'm listening to, but my values. And I actually think that news organizations have to increasingly see our subscribers as members and their subscription, whether it's a tote bag or whatever. But the point is, these are my values. We recently had a little sticker that was on the day that we published our voters guide saying, I voted early, and it had Los Angeles Times under it. Not that many people wearing it outside. We're all mostly so cloistered at home, but people were Instagramming it, they were sharing it. The whole point is what does supporting local news say about me? It says that I care. It says that I'm engaged. It says I want to be in the know.
And I think, that's an essential point, because in a social media dominated world, what we consume, the media that we consume, becomes part of our identity. And it's very important that news is able to participate in that economy, essentially.
You are what you eat, and we're mostly very unhealthy.
Exactly. Yes, there's a news diet and a food diet, and you have to be careful about what you put into your body. Absolutely. Jennifer, do you see any outlets out there or any glimmers of hope for different types of revenue rather than the ones that we've seen so far, which are essentially iterations of the advertising and subscription model?
Yeah, I think philanthropic support has to be part of the future of journalism. And we have to really help people understand that supporting journalism, supporting local journalism is as important as supporting important arts organizations. So I do think that philanthropy really needs to step up. And that means first, we need to raise awareness among place-based foundations, local foundations about the value and importance of supporting original local reporting and equitable and inclusive community news and information that is committed to informing the community and committed to serving the community. So I invite everyone here to join us in early March for Knight's annual Knight Media Forum, where we bring together community foundations, place-based foundations, and journalists who are informing their communities in new and different ways to help identify paths for local funders to support local journalism. But I'll tell you, the easiest plug and play is Newsmatch 2020. It is so easy for a place-based funder, a local funder, a family foundation to find a not-for-profit organization, whether it's a Chalkbeat, which covers education, and if education coverage is important to you, or if it's Orange County, if it's the Voice of Orange County or the Voice of San Diego, two really terrific not-for-profit news sites right here in Southern California. You can work with them and come up with your own match, So one way that we've seen tremendous success among not-for-profit organizations participating in Newsmatch is they've gotten local businesses and local funders to double match the match coming from the National Seed Fund. In Michigan, the Center for Michigan got triple matches. And it really became a great way to not only raise money, but it became a great way for these news organizations to tell their story in the same way public media has been doing for decades, to tell their story about their value and their importance to their community, and to raise awareness among local philanthropists that there's an opportunity to fund them. So I'm happy if anyone wants to contact me and figure out how to plug in to Newsmatch as a funder at any level. I'd be delighted to do so, because one of the initiatives that's being discussed in Washington is potentially scaling Newsmatch to $100 million to a $500 million endowment. We have 267 organizations participating now. We have got to quadruple that number. We've got to, X 100 times that number, because we need to battle misinformation and disinformation with quality, trusted local news information. And I just want to note, again, what Megan said and what Sewell said. At Knight Foundation, and I think all of us agree, there's no silver bullet for delivering local original reporting. There's no silver bullet, and that we have to do it together. We were all once competitors, but we are now collaborators, and we all have to come together. And California has just one great example after another, collaborating, especially around data, efforts that were led at the LA Times, and the collaborative that's now taking place around the police data with the efforts up at Stanford. So collaboration is key. Our focus is serving the community and winning the Pulitzer Prize.
So thank you for that. I guess I want to bring in some of the questions from the audience here, and there's a listener named Rich Weiss who's written in asking about emergency funding, and I'm going to give a little bit of a twist to his question. And he's wondering about if there are other entities that we could rely on to produce the kind of news that we've traditionally gotten from legacy media. You mentioned the Chicago example, but are there other sources that are fulfilling the role of local media that didn't exist before? Should we expand the definition of what we think of as local journalism?
Facebook groups are filling a lot of people's news diets. And let's say some of them are well run. They're not producing original reporting, but some of them are sharing original reporting, and they are sharing in many, many Facebook groups, important and vital community news and information. And sometimes I think that journalists report on how political operatives use Facebook to target and bring in voters and dollars, but don't figure out how to use it for themselves to grow their own audience and to really reach people where they are. So I do think that, and you had also asked like what were other forms of revenue. I wonder if this reporting about these 1,200 news sites will help technology companies understand, all of those 1,300 fake news sites, yes, and I'm using the word fake, let's keep masquerading as news sites, they're all in social feeds as well. So it's time. It is time. It is past time for Facebook and Google to pay for quality original reporting. It's not enough to rise it up higher for it to be higher in search or to be in AMP. That serves Google, that serves users. That does not serve the creators of and does not cover the cost of original local reporting. And Google and Facebook, and we have participated in the very excellent initiatives that they have both been involved in. And we applaud Google and Facebook for those initiatives, both Facebook and Google and the people behind those initiatives are very sincere and earnest in doing good. But enough is enough. They need to pay for quality content. And, it is time for that Section 230 discussion. So they need to be responsible in the way, Sewell is responsible and Megan is responsible for what is on the LA Times news site and what is on KPCC.
So I think that, you're right to bring that up because we're having this conversation about new initiatives in local media, the ways in which local radio stations have reinvented themselves and found different ways of interacting with their audience, and that's all essential. However, we really wouldn't be having this conversation if two companies in the world behave differently. And if the market around the way, if the market of advertisements had been structured differently or could be structured differently, this would be an entirely different conversation.
Because they're making money off of our content, right? They're not creating the original content. These publishers and nonprofit newsrooms are, and then they've made absolute fortunes from that content. And I think if we could all roll back the time machine, maybe we could have approached this differently. But it is like, there's nothing. I don't think there's anything stopping either Facebook or Google from creating a much more significant endowment for American journalism.
And you see me nodding enthusiastically, not because I want Google and Facebook necessarily to be cutting checks to individual publishers. That would be not helpful, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about that the even hundreds of millions they put into local news. And again, I totally agree with Jennifer. These companies are too big to fail. There are good people working within them. They need to be supported. They have been putting in hundreds of millions of dollars to support local news initiatives, but it is a drop in the bucket compared to the devastation that local news in America has experienced since 2004. The departure of the loss of half of all newspaper jobs, the shutting down of so many newspapers, most of them weekly, the bipartisan nature of this problem, because the communities that are the most ill served are also the ones with higher taxes, higher corruption, poorer public services. This is a nonpartisan issue. And the fact is that the news deserts occur even in states that we think of as progressive. California has news deserts. New York State has news deserts. The point is that journalism is a public service. If we don't value it, our democracy will itself wither.
So I would say even Los Angeles has news deserts, Sewell. But there are vast parts of this city and county that don't get any coverage as well. And we need to come up with new solutions for how to address that. But I do think that this is important and not to lose sight of it. We could certainly spend more than an hour beating up on the platforms for the way in which this has unfolded. And I do think it's important to just kind of frame this for a moment, that these are companies that essentially have a team on the field and control the referees. They basically set up the rules for the way in which digital advertising is transacted, and they set up those rules and then also participate in that market so that the field is tilted and it all sort of flows to them. It's not technically illegal, although you could argue, and it is being argued now, that they have excessive market control. Yet at the same time, I think we also agree that simply writing checks to legacy news organizations as they have existed before is not sufficient for the kind of challenges that we're facing, the kind of issues around trust that news did not used to have. And Megan, I just want to ask you, again, with this notion of both sustainability for a local news organization and trust. We have someone asked about sort of the role that local news plays in overcoming fake news, in overcoming issues of trust that exist nationally with news. Jennifer alluded to the fact that earlier, local news organizations seem to be immune to these partisan claims by people saying, you know, this side is biased, that side is not. Yet that is also now eroding. Do you see any opportunity, strategy, approach that local news organizations can take that addresses both the sustainability question and this trust question?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely do. And I think that it gets at, you know, a lot of assumptions I think that we made as traditional journalists about people's understanding about how the news is produced. And I think there's a lot you can do to be a lot more transparent about the production of news and the process that you go through. I'll go back to the Orange County School of the Arts example, and that was a really tense situation where, you know, there were people who were very passionate about that school and didn't believe a single thing should change. And so the reporter went into it knowing that there was going to be a backlash and knowing that there would be people who would doubt the reporting, and thought really actively about it on the front end to make sure that she was explaining where her information came from very clearly, what her sources were, linking to the actual sources, like being just. And I think we forget that people don't know what our rigor is in you know, the profession of journalism. And the more we can make that stuff very clear, whether it's, you know, a link to the actual document, a link to the video, a link to the audio, hearing the person actually say it. I mean, there's all sorts of parts of that I think we can all do. When we do our fire coverage, we have a section on how we're reporting this, you know, and then we make clear that we're doing the best we can in the moment. There may be some things that we get wrong. And if we get it wrong, we're going to correct it. So I think really being transparent in who's reporting it, how they're reporting it, where they're reporting it from, what their sources are all things that I think we kind of used to talk away or hide, and that I think we can really bring to the forefront and just be really crystal clear about what our process is. And I think that does build trust, because I hope it does, because I think you're showing your work, and I hope that people start to understand what journalists do, and I think the process is important, and I think that we should be held accountable too for how we report.
I want to bring up one last question here from an audience member, Rich Weiss again, asking about whether we also need sort of low cost and low quality neighborhood level news. Certainly we see, you mentioned Facebook groups. There's also Nextdoor. Patch is still around and is fairly active in some areas. You know, is there a role for that type of grassroots neighborhood level journalism as well that could benefit the ecosystem?
I think so, and Patch has turned out to be a really vital source of information for small communities, especially around COVID-19 data. We had spoken earlier about like the power of data, and they've used data in very smart ways to for storytelling. But the most important thing about serving serving communities, and that is the national reckoning on racial injustice. And many people trusted news, but traditional legacy newspapers for many years did not have the trust of many people of color, because newsrooms did not, as the Kroner Commission recommended back in 1968, diversify their newsrooms. They did not approach coverage in an inclusive and an equitable way, and they didn't. They just didn't work to build trust with people of color. So I think that the nation is changing, and for news organizations to survive, to be sustainable, bringing that national reckoning on racial equity, on racial justice into our newsrooms, big or small, into our hearts, is going to be key to really helping ensure there's a future for journalism.
In the few seconds we have remaining, I want to ask Sewell just about that, because the Los Angeles Times has just embarked on this fairly large sort of mea culpa type project, with the goal, I think, of trying to stitch back some trust, admitting to past errors, and pledging to do better. Sewell, has there been a reaction to that among your readership?
Well, there's certainly been a very strong community reaction. We received hundreds, if not thousands, of letters, a lot of discussion. There's been great attention. The project, just in case anyone missed it, I'll drop the link in the channel, but it's called Our Reckoning with Racism, and it was both an editorial offering kind of a historic overview of the many ways in which the Times historically, got things wrong, did not pay attention to the transformation of Los Angeles into a majority people of color metropolis. Did not historically neglected or even inaccurately covered communities that are Black, Brown, Latino, Asian, et cetera, and the ways we need to do better, accompanied by essays by our journalists of color about their experiences. So, Gabe, I would say the reaction has been overwhelmingly positive, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating. We need to now actually reorient our coverage and show that we mean it when we say it, that our new commitment has to be covering the diverse communities of LA today. And the good news is that I actually think that is very much in sync with our digital mission, our new business model, and our very survival. I mean, Jennifer raises a really, really good point. I want to be very clear, the decline of local newspapers, including local newspapers, you can't blame that all on the internet. It's been going on in some ways for decades, whether because of earlier technologies like radio and TV, or whether because we were just so, we had so much print advertising revenue. We were gluttons, talking about 60 years ago, and we didn't invest that money into covering a changing America, covering low income or disempowered communities, helping them gain their empowerment civically and economically. This is a chance now for us to empower our readers, and in so doing, also find a path for our own sustainability.
I think that's a great note on which to wrap this up. I want to thank our panelists, Megan Garvey, Jennifer Preston, and Sewell Chan. And I also want to thank our audience here who has participated, and thank you for the great questions. I think all of us here and the audience would agree that this is really an issue of immense importance to global citizenship, to healthy communities, and that we all need this kind of thinking and this kind of support in order to make these changes, which I think is going to benefit everybody. So thank you all. Thank you for being with us. You can also find on our website the previous 2 sessions of this. So I hope you can look those up. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, Gabe and Kristen.